and welcome to episode 55 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph.
Hey, I'm Gwen Pearson, the entomologist formerly known as Bug Girl, and I'm broadcasting to you from far north, Ohio, where it's quite cold.
Hi, I'm Heidi Smith. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley. I'm a PhD student at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
And I'm Stephen Hamlin. I'm a postdoc at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia.
And this week we're lucky to be joined today by Dr. Marlene Zook, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota, as well as the author of Sex on Six Legs, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later today. Marlene, thanks for joining us today. You want to say hi and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, and I'm glad to be on the show. I'm, like you said, I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. Most of my work is on sexual selection and the evolution of sex differences. I mostly work on insects, and I'm also really interested in rapid evolution.
We just had the symposium for Mike's birthday, and Doug Emlin was here, and we were talking a lot about how different it is to write a book for the public than how it is to write papers. And he said he'd worked a lot with different editors, and I wondered how writing a book has changed the way you write papers.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think it really has. It is absolutely the case that writing a book is really different than writing scientific papers, mostly because you think differently about who your audience is and you think differently about the way you have to justify what you're saying and so forth. But I don't think it's changed the way I write scientific papers because that's so formulaic. And part of why I like writing more general things like books, or I do a lot of stuff for magazines and newspapers, part of why I like that is that it's a much looser format and you don't have to stick to that formulaic pattern.
I mean, I really like I haven't read Paleo Fantasy all the way through yet, but I love that idea. I was always surprised how many scientists actually follow this like paleo diet.
I've been trying studiously to stay away from people telling me whether or not they're on the paleo diet. So this is one of the unexpected things that happens when you write a book, is that people will then feel that they have free rein to come up and talk to you about their personal thing. And so my first book was about sex and gender and animal behavior, and it's called Sexual Selections: What We Can and Can't Learn About Sex from Animals. And so with that one, people were telling me stories about animal sex and, from various things, or sometimes about their own sex lives, and it was a little too weird hearing stuff about, people wanting to talk about the evolution of female orgasm or whatever. And then my second book, which is called Riddled with Life and is about parasites and disease and evolution, then suddenly people started talking to me about their bowel problems, and that was way worse. Which was not something I'd necessarily anticipated happening actually from either book. And so, you get all kinds of stories. And then with Paleo Fantasy, people are telling me lots of stuff about what they eat, or mostly stuff about what their annoying relative/friend eats, that they want to use my book as a justification to argue with said annoying relative/friend about why they shouldn't be eating that. And really, mostly, as I keep repeating, I did not write a diet book. I'm really not interested in writing a diet book. I think people should figure out what they want to eat and then go do it. But somehow the diet stuff really brings out a lot of passion in people.
Well, I loved Paleo Fantasy. I was actually listening to it in audio form as I was walking around ESEB, and I was struck by some of the reviews that I saw of the book, which seemed to be very, very much a moving the goalposts thing, where they said, oh well, gee, it's a great book, but you totally didn't get paleo right. It's all different than what you were talking about there. That's just a straw man.
Yes, and so exactly, like, I'm really not trying to what I wanted to try and do, and maybe fairly enough, I clearly did not achieve this. What I wanted to do was think about the way that we often apply evolution to our own lives, and one of the first places we do that is by saying, the world now does not look like the world the way it was maybe as little as a few hundred, and certainly it doesn't look like the way it did several thousand years ago when we think of the human species evolving. And so it seems really different, and yet we're also suffering from all of these maladies, like we're overweight, we've got diabetes, we've got all these other things wrong with us. So it's reasonable enough to suggest that there's this mismatch between where and how we evolved and what's going on now. And I get that, and I actually think that's a really reasonable starting point, and I agree with a lot of the mismatch stuff. But at the same time, it just seemed weird to then conclude that, oh, we'd evolved to this point of perfection in the Pleistocene or before agriculture or whenever you want to pick, and that somehow having evolved to this pinnacle, we now can't move off of it because dire, terrible things will happen. And I think that just represents a basic misunderstanding of how evolution really works. And that was what I was interested in, and that's really what motivated me to write the book. And the diet stuff seemed to be a really kind of funny manifestation of this misapprehension.
Well, anytime you talk about human evolution, like you touched on in the book here, obviously, you're going to get a lot of people who react very viscerally to it, and the diet stuff, and any ranging from paleo to creationist, I'm sure. Have you been getting a lot of blowback in that regard?
Zero. So that's the interesting thing, is that it's possible that from a creationist perspective, I'm just viewed as a lost cause. Like it's just so obvious I'm so far down that road that there's really no point trying to bring me back to whatever. So no, several people have asked whether I've had reactions from creationists or from people who are just sending me random weird emails, talking about Jesus or whatever, and absolutely not. I have got, again, so what I have gotten is people sending me random emails saying, but you can't, hate on the paleo diet because I stopped eating dairy, and so how can you, and my acne is, like so much better, and my skin cleared up, and I feel a lot better, and, like the phlegm, and, all of this stuff, and so, like, how can you say the paleo diet is bad? And, like, first of all, like, way TMI on the acne and the phlegm, like, really do not need to hear about, this from people. But second of all, that's just, fine, go with God, or if that isn't too, like, weird a saying to have in this circumstance, but it's fine. Like, if people think that cutting out dairy has been good for them, that's just not my point.
Do you write back to these people, or do you just write gross thanks?
I hadn't thought about just writing gross thanks. That's an interesting response. For people who are genuinely interested in engaging, I do. And that's something else that you discover when you do a lot with the public, and I think that Gwen/Bug can discuss this way better than I can about what it's like when people from the public are emailing you. I mean, you must get way more of the, this is why you have on your website a thing saying Bug Girl will not diagnose you. See, at least I have not gotten pictures, so you way outrank me in this regard.
Learn from my fail. Never, ever write a book about pubic lice. Ever.
Okay, to be kept in mind. Note to self, yes. Note to self. Stay away from that. But, it is surprising, because people, of course, want to talk about what they want to talk about, and I understand that. And so if your book gives them this tiny in for talking about whatever thing they wanted to talk about, whether that's giving up dairy or, their bowel problems or whatever, then, they're going to do that. And that's, it's okay. People... when you write stuff, you do just put it out there. So that's the other big lesson from writing something for the public, is that when you write for a scientific audience, it seems like it's going to a much more constrained group of people, and you have a lot more sort of back and forth about what happens, and you say, oh no, but you didn't look at this data set, and here's how I responded to that reviewer. But then once you've written something for the public, then it's out, and you're done. And you're, if people want to say that you've written an entire book, I don't know, about, aliens, and you didn't, then you don't really have a lot of recourse, which has been an interesting thing to get adjusted to.
Yeah, it seems like the caveman diet people are fervent, like creationists.
I think people get really fervent about food. I did have someone say the only other topic that they think that people get equally fervent about is child rearing, so that there's just nothing that will bring out didactic, people who want to tell you exactly what you should be doing. Then, if you announce that you're pregnant, and suddenly everyone knows exactly what the right way to raise a baby is. Or for that matter, the right way to, have childbirth or whatever. So I think, food is kind of like that people are really convinced that what they're eating is just, the greatest thing that they are eating, or, whatever.
I'm going to use your remark from a second ago about moving the conversation onto what other people want to talk about, because I want to talk about crickets.
Let's talk. Great. You're not going to get any objection. We all want to talk about crickets. Everyone always wants to talk about crickets, of course.
Excellent. We'll exclude Stephen from this conversation then. So
Does Stephen not want to talk about crickets? How could he not want to talk about crickets?
He doesn't know about animals.
Thanks.
He just likes numbers and whiteboards.
Okay.
Yeah.
We all like those too.
So I was just wondering if I think your research project that you have going on in Hawaii is just incredible, and I was wondering if you could give a kind of general overview to our listeners about what you have going on there.
Sure, and I just actually got back last week from doing some field stuff in Hawaii, which also meant that I got to miss the whole polar vortex in the Midwest, for which I'm really I'm really grateful. So it's all quite fresh in my mind. But sure, so I work on a species of cricket that is widely distributed. It's mostly in subtropical regions of northern Australia and then the Pacific Islands, places like Tahiti, Fiji, Samoa. It's been introduced by people to Hawaii. In Hawaii, and only in Hawaii, it's subject to an acoustically orienting parasitoid fly, which means that it's a parasitic fly that homes in on the calls of the males. So male crickets all sing to attract a mate. Once they find a calling male, they deposit larvae on and around the cricket, which then burrow inside and spend the next 7 to 10 days eating the tissue of the cricket while it's still alive, and then eventually bursting out in, you know, this alien-like fashion, just like all the science fiction movies, and kill the cricket in the process. And so I got interested. I mean, this is a really interesting phenomenon from a number of perspectives, and I got interested in it because, to me, it represents this really cool way to study the conflict between natural selection and sexual selection. So sexual selection has to do with, you know, competition for getting mates or for, you know, reproduction, and natural selection obviously is for survival. And here the male has this big dilemma, because the more he sings, the more likely he is to attract this fly, which is obviously bad from a natural selection standpoint because, you know, decreases survival. But it's also really good to sing more, because then it's more likely that he's going to attract a female. So sexual selection and natural selection are working in exactly opposite ways, which is a conflict that's actually interested biologists since Darwin, who, you know, also talked about it. And I wanted to, and this is a really great way to look at it, because in this, the interaction between this sort of fly and similar singing insects is known from other parts of, like, North America, and also from to some degree in Australia. But in this case, we have places where the cricket naturally occurs and doesn't get the parasite, and then places where it does, and so you've got kind of a natural experiment. And we worked for many, many years on how exactly this dilemma gets worked out by the males. Most recently, we discovered something completely serendipitously that I think is incredibly cool, which is that on, well, now 2 of the islands, a large proportion of the males now have this wing mutation that makes them unable to call. So they're completely silent. They can't produce the song to attract mates, but they're now completely protected from the fly. And this occurred on the first island that we were studying on Kauai. It occurred in less than 20 generations, which is, as you know, remarkably rapid evolution. And yet it occurred in the wild, so it was not, you know, it is an introduced species, but they're not, you know, being controlled, or there's nothing that, you know, humans are doing to them. And so it's a really interesting case of extremely rapid signal evolution in a wild species, and we just don't have a lot of occasions to see that. So I was really interested in how that might work. And then, of course, the biggest question for me was, well, all right, this does protect them from the fly, and we can demonstrate that they don't get parasitized if they're obligate silenced. But then how do you find a mate? As I always tell my students, it's a very big, dark world, at least for a cricket. I mean, it's kind of a big, dark world for everybody, but it's really a big, dark world for crickets. And so what do you do if you can't produce a call to attract females? And so a lot of our work in my lab for the last, I don't know, almost 10 years now has been associated with that. We're also starting to get into some of the genetics of this trait. I'm collaborating with a former postdoc of mine, Nathan Bailey, who's at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he's doing a lot of genomic work to try and understand the basis for this rapid mutation. It's inherited as a single gene, and so we've done kind of the simplistic Mendelian stuff to the crosses to show that that's the case. But trying to understand it in a little bit more detail is something we're hoping to do in the really near future. So anyway, that was probably more detail than you necessarily wanted to hear. But what we could talk about crickets for the whole time, really. And actually, to bring this back to the book, if you are in, so really, that got me thinking a lot about rapid evolution and how it happens. And then that got me thinking about the way people look at evolution and how they often think about it as something that, oh, it always takes millions of years and it's like the rise of the dinosaurs. But they seldom think about how evolution is happening all the time and it's happening to us.
So I think last time I spoke to Nathan, then he was saying that on the second island, then we thought it might be possible that it's a different mutation that's occurred.
Yeah, and so I can't say anything more because we're still kind of in review and all of that. But yeah, it looks like some really freaky things are happening. And we are at a loss to. I'm at a loss to understand why the timing of this was occurring, because I've worked on these crickets for over 20 years now, and we first noticed the mutation only on Kauai, and we first noticed it when it sort of suddenly all of the males, almost like all but say 10 or 15%, exhibited the mutation, and that happened within the space of about 5 years, which is where I get this 20 generations thing. And then within, like, say 3 or 4 years after that, and that was in 2003, and then 3 or 4 years after that, we started seeing it on Oahu, and the proportions crept up very rapidly there. And so if they really are two different mutations, how in the world, what's responsible for that going on in two different places within such a short time period when we know the crickets have been there for quite a long time? And so my most recent trip suggested that it may be that the mutations kind of, burbling along at a very low level. You would never notice it if you didn't know to look for it if it is at a low level, and that, it keeps getting knocked back, and then periodically you get these outbreaks and you see it in large numbers. But there's no reason you would look for it because, crickets look like crickets, and you have to look at them, you have to really know what a cricket looks like and look at it fairly closely to realize it's got this mutation.
So what about the female preferences in this system then? How are they changing along with the, are things changing with the females as well as with the males?
I think that what this is exhibiting, or what we're seeing here, and this has now become my latest big thing that I'm interested in, is that pre-existing behavioral flexibility can act as kind of a gatekeeper for evolution. So what I mean by that is that if you think about it, obviously there continue to be crickets, so there must have been, so even though the males can't sing, the females are going ahead and mating with them, and that really in some ways shouldn't happen, A, because they shouldn't be able to find them, and B, because even if they can find them, the males are supposed to sing, the males in most crickets do sing this structurally different song called a courtship song that is required by the female before she'll go ahead and accept a spermatophore. So okay, these males can't do either, so by rights, this should have died out. They didn't. And so, okay, one possibility is that suddenly, concomitantly with, simultaneously with the single gene mutation that renders the wings different, we then also had a bunch of other mutations in female type genes that allowed them to respond differently to males or use some other signal or whatever. Well, that just seems ridiculous. I mean, why would, that seems very unparsimonious to suggest. And anyway, I don't even understand a mechanism by which that could happen. So instead, what we think is going on is that, let's say you're a cricket and your environment varies, because of course all environments vary, and let's say it varies in how many other singing males you hear as you're developing. If you grow up in a quiet world, which you could do not just because there's a bunch of these flatwings, as we call the mutants, but also, I don't know, you're in a lousy habitat, or the sex ratio is very female biased and so there aren't a lot of callers, or there's been a recent storm or other catastrophic event that's wiped out a lot of your population. If you have kind of a pre-existing flexible, we'll call it a rule of thumb, that just says, I don't hear very much going on around me, so if I'm a female and I run into a male, regardless of whether he gives a courtship song or not, I'm really going to go ahead and mate with him. Similarly, if you're a male and you have a rule of thumb that says if I grow up in a silent world and I hear another male, I should really go over toward him because that's going to be a much better way to find females. And of course, all of this is not happening consciously or in any, it just requires some very simple responses to something they're hearing. If they've already got those behaviors on board, so to speak, then when the flatwings emerge, the trait's going to be able to become established because the crickets already have the behavior that allows them to incorporate it. And then that started me thinking about, well, how often does this happen? Maybe it happens a lot. Maybe under a lot of circumstances, there's behavior that either allows or doesn't allow a completely novel trait to become established. And I think this, for me, has been a really interesting way to link behavior with evolution in a way that I hadn't thought about before, and in a way maybe a lot of other people hadn't thought about before. So again, I think that this whole idea that evolution's happening all the time and there's always this kind of give and take is part of the larger message that I wanted to get across in the book.
I just wanted to ask a point of clarification. So your two
Sure.
different mutations, are they two different mutations within the same gene, or are they two different gene mutations?
Stay tuned.
Okay.
I mean, seriously, you're asking stuff that's literally, we're literally working that out right now, and without, I mean, I could give you some of the, I could give you some of the incredibly nerdy details about, what we know so far, but some of this stuff, I'm not a genomics person, and so I'm kind of, looking at Wikipedia, half the time after I get an email from my colleagues, saying, okay, and what was that? What's rad sequencing again? So I'm still just kind of hanging on by my fingernails, but yeah, we don't know that level of detail yet, and I'm hoping that. I actually am hoping that really soon, maybe even within weeks, we'll have that answer.
That's really exciting.
It is,
Awesome.
and like I said, it's this whole sort of evolution in front of your eyes thing that I really do think is amazing, and we really did just stumble on it. It's not like I went out saying, oh, I really want to find an example of evolution happening in the wild that I can study and where I can do lab experiments and so forth. It just sort of unfolded.
That's pretty cool. See, Breaking Bio is literally right on the edge right here. So I'm a fly guy, so all this cricket talk, I know Tom loves it, but I gotta ask.
We can talk about the flies. You want to talk about the flies? The flies are cool too.
Of course I want to talk about the flies. So the flies actually can hear, and they can hear these calls, obviously. Has anybody been looking at how the flies have been responding to the crickets going silent?
So the flies are really difficult to study, in part because you never see them. The only way you can see flies is by putting a speaker in the field and waiting for flies to come. A former graduate student of mine, Robin Tingatella, who's now at the University of Denver, worked on this for a PhD. And when we were in the field, one of the first times we were putting out fly traps with a playback, and you just set something up right at sunset, and then you go and we're working on the grounds of the University of Hawaii Hilo for that one, and so it's not actually a very glamorous field. But this is the other thing I always have to point out to people is that if you think this all sounds really exciting not like I don't like Hawaii, but believe me, we're spending all of our time on our hands and knees, in the grass in the dark on a lawn. It's really not all that glamorous. But anyway, so we put out a fly trap and went and sat for about 20 minutes or so, and then I told her, oh, we'll go check and see if we've gotten anything. And we had 14 or 15 flies in 20 minutes, and she came running back saying, oh my God, what is going, where have they all been? Because they're actually pretty big. They're about the size of a small housefly. They're way bigger than a Drosophila. And so she was, completely how come I haven't seen them? And I said, well, you don't have anything they want. So you don't see them unless you put out a trap. So there's very little known about their natural lives. Their hearing is totally cool, and there are people, there's actually a guy at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, Andrew Mason, who's been working on them for many years, and also Ron Hoy at Cornell and a few other people, Danielle Robert, who's now in, I think, either Switzerland or Germany. And so their ears are very interesting because, so you have to hear a cricket sound if you're going to parasitize crickets, but most flies have ears or hearing apparatus that are very, very different from the hearing apparatus that's on, a cricket or other related insect. They have sensory cells on the antennae that vibrate and that they use to hear with, and their hearing is actually not all that great. These flies have what are essentially cricket ears that are tympanal ears, so they have a vibrating membrane that's actually on the body, which is where crickets have their ears, on the legs or on the body. And so they have essentially cricket ears on a fly body, and they are better at localizing cricket sound than a female cricket is. So Andrew Mason, in case anybody's interested and needs another website on which to spend time, Andrew Mason has a super cool website, like I say, he's at the University of Toronto at Scarborough, where he shows the flies responding to playback from either a left or right speaker. And they're on a modified, like an old-fashioned computer mouse ball, you know, that's sort of like upside, so like the ball part, so they're walking on it. And then sound comes out of one speaker or the other, and you would swear that the fly turns to the speaker before you hear the sound. They're that good. And so their hearing is incredibly acute, and their localizing ability is incredibly good, which enables them to actually find their hosts. This turns out, incidentally, to have some potentially practical applications, because for people who are hard of hearing, if you're trying to develop hearing aids, one of the difficult problems, it's not just a matter of cranking up the volume, right? You need to be able to distinguish the sounds that you want to hear from among the background sounds, and that's often really difficult, and it's called the cocktail party effect, and lots of people have worked on this. You know, how do you distinguish the conversation you want to listen to among, you know, a whole bunch of other people talking? And so the fact that these and the way we do it, the way humans do it, of course, is by comparing what comes into one ear versus what comes into the other ear, which works better if your ears are far apart. These are little tiny flies, and their ears are very close together, and so how do they do that? So the answer to that is hopefully going to help people develop better hearing aids.
See, flies doing things better than the insects themselves and solving all the world's problems. This is why
flies could solve all the world's problems, but I think they just don't want to. I think that's the thing. They just don't want to. You know, it's like with cats. You could train them. You know, they could be trained. They just don't want to be trained.
I'm just here, you know, representing the young'uns. And I was thinking while you were talking, I'm like, especially when talking about genomics, I was like, yes, another whole organism biologist, yes, because it's really the time when I was trained. You know, there wasn't an internet, there weren't genomics, and so there's just this incredible change, not just in the way that we do biology, but also in the way that we talk about what we do and how things like writing a popular book are viewed. Because I think 20 years ago, writing a popular book, and Marlene, you can tell me if you think I'm off or not, but at least in entomology, it was kind of like, well, that's interesting. And now it's a really good thing.
Not necessarily. Well, I don't know. You have to have somebody else at that. But so yeah, and a bunch of people have certainly asked me whether, you know, I feel like writing popular books has been good or bad for my kind of day job. And you know, the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I certainly have the luxury of not having to worry about it that much. But because, you know, I do have a day job, I have tenure, and I also, you know, it's not like I've given up doing my lab research, you know, doing my regular science research, which to me also enriches the kind of stuff I write a lot. Yeah. So I don't think that people think it's great necessarily that I've written a popular book. And one always hesitates, well, I don't know whether it's popular or not. I mean, it's, you know, certainly probably sold more copies than any of my scientific papers have ever, like, seen the light of day for. But yeah, I think it's a very mixed bag. And people who are interested, in case there is anyone who's going to listen who wants to know about writing for the public, my advice at least is to not give up your day job, because I think being a practicing scientist and also communicating with the public has given me a really different perspective on a lot of this that I would be sad to give up. So I really enjoy sort of wearing both hats.
I was just going to say, don't quit your day job is excellent advice, because I quit my day job and I've been unemployed for a year now. Don't do that.
Yeah. I you know, and I wish that I personally could you know, help you out. I have to admit, I really do. I really do.
I'm good, but yeah, if another one of those learn from my fail. See, this is my function, is to make all the mistakes so everybody else can learn. I'm sort of like a global object lesson.
Okay, global object lesson. All right.
Well, that pretty much wraps up what we have time for today. But Marlene, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to tell us about, or where can people follow along with your future research and work?
Let's see, what do I have coming up? I mean, I have lots of travel stuff coming up and places I'm going to be speaking and so forth, but I think that's the timing of that's not useful for you. And thank you for not asking about, am I already working on my next book? Because no, I'm not. And oh my God, like people keep asking, like, what do you think I am? A machine? People. But I get this all the time. And like the other book just came out, and it was like less than a year ago. So.
Yeah, but what have you done for us lately?
I know, that's everybody's thing.
All right. Well, we'll be anxiously awaiting the next one when you feel comfortable in starting it. Everybody at home, you can find us online at breakingbio.com, on Twitter at breakingbio, or even on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. And again, thanks for listening, and here's hoping no one out there is using this podcast to find us as parasitic progeny hosts.
That was terrible.
Bye.